Hello, World History 1 students. This is Mr. Everton, and this is a video about the early civilization of Mesopotamia. We're going to talk about a bunch of different innovations that were created in Mesopotamia, and at the end of the video, you need to pick one of them and explain in 3 to 4 sentences why you think it is the most important. So this map hopefully looks familiar from our last unit. In our last unit, we talked about this region, and we talked in our video on Neolithic sites, and here is Gary, the honor student, who is so excited to tell me what the name of this region is, even though it's already written on the map. Go ahead and tell me, Gary. Go ahead. Yes, Gary, it is the Fertile Crescent, and it is where Aleppo and Jericho were located. Those were two of the earliest cities in the entire world, and other cities formed in this same region, the Fertile Crescent. The Fertile Crescent, also part of the Fertile Crescent, is called Mesopotamia, and that's what we're talking about today. Civilizations that developed in ancient Mesopotamia, which is part of the Fertile Crescent. And Mesopotamia is actually Greek. It means the land between the rivers. And you might be saying to yourself, Mr. Everton, what rivers? What land? What is this? What rivers is this land between? And the answer to that, dear student, is the Tigris and the Euphrates. The Tigris is further to the east, the Euphrates is further to the west, and the two of them together make this a remarkably, an area of remarkably fertile soil, which meant that farming could prosper here and could lead to complex societies like the one you see illustrated here. You can see that this city-state has walls around it and has a ziggurat temple in the center, and that there is farmland scattered all around the exterior of the wall, and that there are irrigation ditches channeling the water from the river to the crops that are growing in those fields. Because of this, it led to a surplus of food in Mesopotamia, and it led to complex societies with many of the features of civilization. So one feature that was present in Mesopotamia was religion, and religion in Mesopotamia was polytheistic. Polytheism means believing in many gods and goddesses. And here you can see a picture of some artifacts from ancient Sumer, which is in Mesopotamia. These are statues of some of the many Mesopotamian gods and goddesses. And people would believe in multiple gods and goddesses and believe that they were all equally present. And that usually these gods or goddesses would represent different features of the world, like the river or the sun, or the earth, or the moon. And as part of their religion, different cities would build temples called ziggurats, like what's illustrated here, and people would go to that temple and they would believe that the god actually lived in the temple, that the ziggurat was a home for the god or goddess. A priest would also live there. Priests were the most powerful members of early Mesopotamian society, and people would go there and pray to the god and make sacrifices, and the priest would oversee that. Another important feature of Mesopotamian civilization is writing. And in ancient Mesopotamia, this takes the form of cuneiform. Cuneiform is pictured here. It was invented in ancient Sumer, which was a collection of independent city-states in Mesopotamia. The only people who knew how to write cuneiform in ancient Sumer were called scribes. Cuneiform was incredibly complicated. There were many different symbols that represented different words. It wasn't like today where we have an alphabet and you use different characters to say, you can assemble characters in different ways to make words. Each word, each idea had its own symbol that you had to learn in order to be able to draw it. And scribes would take a stylus like what you see pictured here, and they would etch these wedge shapes into a clay tablet and then leave the clay out in the sun to dry and harden. Scribes were important members of Mesopotamian society. Here you can see a wall engraving. That's just my T, pardon me. You can see some scribes are who work for the government are recording the number of heads of enemies that have been killed. So on the left-hand side of this image, you can see a soldier stacking up heads of killed enemies, and the scribes are writing down the numbers of the heads to report back to the government how many people were killed in the battle. So speaking of Mesopotamian government, that's a really important feature of Mesopotamian society. Mesopotamian government was a theocracy, by which I mean that the king had religious authority. Theocracy means the king has religious authority. People believed that the king was able to communicate with a god or gods, plural. And this is one of the reasons why the king had power. Another important aspect of these kings was that they were parts of hereditary dynasties. That means that when the king died, his son would become the new king. That power passed down in the family from one king to his son to the next son. And if for some reason there was no son, then it would go to like the king's brother or his nephew or some other relative. Government in ancient Mesopotamia originally took the form of independent city-states. A city-state is a city that is a government, and the government just runs that city. And the example here is ancient Sumer. You can see in the orangish color here a bunch of dots: Kish, Nippur, Lagash, Uruk, etc. Those are all Sumerian city-states. There are about 12 of them, and they were independent of each other and competed against each other. Later, governments would form that were larger, and these governments were empires. An empire controls many diverse peoples, controls many different kinds of people, and it uses military force in order to force them to belong to this empire. And an example of this is ancient Babylon. Babylon was an empire that took over, I know this map is of the Akkadian Empire, but the Babylonian Empire was about the same territory. So we're going to finish up talking about one particular king of the Babylonian Empire. Hammurabi was a king of the Babylonian Empire, and he had the problem of trying to unify his empire and make sure that it ran smoothly. And in order to do this, he came up with a law code, a group of about 250-ish laws that he used in order to organize his empire and make sure that everything was running smoothly. This is a picture of Hammurabi's code, and you should hopefully be able to recognize it from something earlier in the video. Gary, the honor student, recognizes it, don't you, Gary? What is it? Yes, Gary, that is cuneiform. The Babylonians got cuneiform from the Sumerians, and they used it as well. This is a picture of a statue with Hammurabi's code etched into it in cuneiform. And you can see Hammurabi on the top talking to the god Shamash, I believe, who is giving him authority. It's a theocracy, remember. Here's a zoom in on that. Hammurabi is on the left, and he is being given power by the god Shamash, who is sitting down in that throne. So Hammurabi's code is one of the world's earliest written law codes, and it was based on retribution, which basically means like revenge. So if you do something bad, then we're going to do that bad thing to you. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth is an expression you may have heard of before, and Hammurabi's code very much uses that principle. Like if you accidentally put out somebody else's eye, it doesn't matter if it was an accident, we're going to put your eye out. If you kill somebody, then you will be killed. Except, and this is a big important exception, because of social classes, if a rich man does something to a poor man, then he doesn't have to have his eye put out. Instead, he has to pay a fine. So like if you do something to your equal, like if I put out the eye of somebody who's the same status as me, then I will have my eye put out. But if I put out the eye of somebody who is lower than me, then I will just have to pay a fine. And this is evidence of social classes in ancient Mesopotamia. So to summarize, we talked about a lot of stuff today. We talked about the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which helped society to begin in ancient Mesopotamia. We talked about polytheism, which is believing in more than one god. Cuneiform, the writing system of ancient Mesopotamia. We talked about scribes, who were the people who did the writing. We talked about theocracy, which is when a priest or a king has religious power. We talked about the difference between a city-state and an empire, and we wrapped up by talking about Hammurabi's code. And Mr. T wants to remind you that he pities the fool who doesn't answer the AIM question in 3 to 4 complete sentences. So make sure that you do that. I'll talk to you next time. It's not letting me, it just wants to keep the video going.